Welcome back. This is the Did You Know section from Area 9, where, as I mentioned in the last video, I wanted to think through a little bit more of this idea, this methodology that Tucker refers to as the Nevius method, named after John Nevius. And so I wanted us to think a little bit in this video about the impact of this method and its importance. So here we go. One of the remarkable church growth stories of the modern era has taken place in, well, what is now called South Korea. For much of its history, Korea had not been on the radar of early Roman Catholic missionaries or Protestant missionaries, for that matter. When Protestant missionaries did begin arriving in the late 1800s, initial growth was pretty slow for the first few years until the tide shifted significantly. While there were a number of factors for the change in perspective, one that we need to consider is the missionary strategy of the American missionary John Nevius and this methodology that bears his name. As Tucker points out in your reading, the Nevius method emphasized churches that were self-governing, self-supporting, and self-propagating. Sort of the three big self-statements really, I think, capture what Nevius and his method was about. Self-governing, we want self-governing churches, we want self-supporting churches, and we want self-propagating churches. So Nevius's method promoted indigenous church structures rather than a European or American model. It downplayed the control and influence of Western missionaries in favor of local leadership. In other words, a Korean church needed Korean pastors who led authentically free from the watchful and intrusive eye of outsiders. Thus, the idea of self-governing. With local leadership, the church should also assume responsibility for financially supporting its own work. Nevius did not want local congregations in Korea being dependent on missionaries or agencies for financial support. Local churches needed to raise their own support, thus self-supporting. Finally, local churches needed to take responsibility for their own evangelism and discipleship. This was not the work of missionaries by themselves, but of each member of the congregation. Mature Korean believers were not encouraged to become traveling evangelists, but to remain at home in their sphere of influence, to evangelize and disciple, and to train others to do the same. This he called self-propagation. Now, one of the part of the context for this, one of the issues that Nevius had with many missionaries in his own day was that they had grown comfortable in their surroundings. Many missionaries stayed in the relative comfort of the missionary compound and sent out their all-star converts, the native believers, to do the work of the traveling evangelist. And so he would take them out of their own communities, or the missionaries would take them out of their own communities and send them out to do the work of traveling evangelical preaching. Nevius thought that this process should be flipped. The missionaries ought to fulfill the role of the traveling itinerant evangelist, building local churches, raising up local leaders, and then leaving them to figure it out, while the missionary went elsewhere to begin the process over again. Arguably, this is much more of a sort of a Pauline model when you think about the Apostle Paul and how he established and set up local churches and raised up leaders, and then let them figure it out with help and correction as needed. But this was very much the idea that Nevius was trying to put into place as well. Now, the method itself offered a real challenge to business as usual missionary efforts. And as a result, many missionaries, especially those in China where Nevius had worked and had tried to implement this strategy, many of them opposed the ideas presented by Nevius. The newer Korean missionaries, they had not been on the field nearly as long or had as much history. Many of them embraced the plan, and the results are very telling. The Korean church grew rapidly, not only numerically, but also in depth and strength. This was put to the test in the early 20th century when Korea came under Japanese rule and Christianity was actively persecuted. Like the early days of persecution by Roman emperors, if you think all the way back to week 1 in the semester, in Korea, likewise, the church continued to flourish and to grow. Part of this, I think, was because Christianity had taken deep roots in Korea, where believers saw Christianity as their own rather than an American import. But Christianity also thrived in difficult times because the indigenous Korean leaders emphasized the importance of Bible study for local believers. Therefore, in times of struggle, the Korean believers